I'm going to share with you my approach to working with moving images, how I came upon moving images or abstraction and animation. It wasn't a typical traditional way of coming to this field. I was a painter at home, like I was a kind of what you call an amateur painter. I was involved in small exhibitions in my local town and school. I always painted. It's something that I always just did, and drawing. But one of my other loves was music, so I ended up studying music. Was a music teacher for several years in a prison in Ireland, and then decided I'd like to go back and retrain. So I did a music technology course with the idea that maybe I could start looking at doing sound design for film. I was very interested in maybe other opportunities because I was also interested in mathematics. Not in a very strong way, but I did maths with music in my degree. So I was very drawn to this course. It was a 2-year intensive program in music technology in 96 to 98. And while I was doing that course, I discovered something completely different. And I moved away kind of from music and moved more to abstraction and animated imagery. So what I'm going to share with you today is kind of my journey, where I came from, what I was trying to do, and how I kind of accidentally came across moving imagery. So I'm going to look at 3 themes that were kind of identified kind of in my practice, or maybe the teleology of how I came to visual music, because I didn't initially, call this visual music. I used to call it a visual form of musique concrète, because I didn't have another name for it, nor was I even aware of film being experimental or animation being abstract. I had no knowledge of these areas. I just knew about cinema and storytelling and maybe having nice music for film. So I'm going to hopefully I'll go through this talk. It won't be too long. And then I'm going to show a very short screening of some works where I really did start to arrive at what I call the idea of a visual music. And I'll explain to you that. And I'm not going to show you the full works because we'll be here for a long time. They're quite long. So I'm showing short extracts from them, like 4 to 5 minutes. So that's in the short screening afterwards. So just starting off then with music technology. My starting point for working with moving imagery came from music technology. I was a student there, and I really could not believe what I could learn with sound. Up to this point, I actually thought that I understood music as being what, maybe if you learn music through music theory, I understood it being about a music score, that you analysed, that you actually learned the structures of music, and in the abstract, you learned them in your mind. Like you came to understand music through these abstract concepts. I was a musician. I played cello, I played piano, and I loved playing all these instruments and getting to grips with rhythm and harmony and counterpoint. And I liked that idea of the musicianship. It was in your body when you're playing. So I knew that music had this power, but notes is what I thought music was. That was it. But when I arrived into this course, maybe some of you are aware of music technology. My mind was opened up to this other world that I never knew about. And maybe it's the same possibly when you're doing animation, when you come to understand abstraction. It was this idea that the note was not the smallest unit, but in fact, the smallest unit of sound was the harmonic, or this kind of sine wave. It was based on physics. So this course that I did was an intensive 2-year program. It was set up by an engineer who had an interest in music, and he decided that he wanted artists to learn about engineering and science, and then engineers to learn about creativity. So he had a creative component to the course where we had to create compositions, but we also had to do mathematics, we had to do digital signal processing. I designed an echo to the DSP chipboard, and so you had to learn machine language and all that, and it was quite hard. But basically, for me, what I couldn't get over, that sound could be reduced to this sine wave, that it was a simple physical phenomena of vibration, that, and when it was in a mathematical ratio, you get pitched sounds, and when it wasn't quite mathematical in terms of the combination of these sine waves, you got slightly dissonant sound or inharmonicity. So I was just blown away that this was actually a physical thing, that this harmony that we had come to know was actually something that was in our hearing, it was something in the air. It completely blew me apart in terms of, I don't know music now, I don't understand. But what I came to really like, because we were also introduced to electroacoustic music, music, tape music, music where you use sirens, sounds, noises. Again, my knowledge of music had ended in, say, 85 when I was doing my degree, and the last composer I had really looked at that was very experimental was Stravinsky. But I wasn't aware of Varese or all these other composers that used noises, created noise machines, sounds. So it was really exciting to realize that the sound world could be anything. So I was kind of obsessed with the fact that maybe sound could be noises, recordings, and these could be musical. So for some reason that really appealed to me. I always found maybe the music and abstract a little bit difficult. When I would be doing my composition exercises, I was always getting consecutive octaves and fifths and all the wrong, and I was always doing mistakes. So the idea that I could get access to sound in a different way was very appealing. So therefore we were taught how to record sound, and we were taught how to operate on the sound. And so it was a really kind of a blast. So I came across these new concepts, the idea that, as I said, the harmonic motion, the fact that I was very interested in timbre, musical instruments, what they sounded like, and that they could be made up of harmonics. They had a certain science to them, but it's because they're being represented now mathematically. In order to be represented in the computer, they had to be reduced to mathematics. So the idea that you could then, summation, the timbre, say the tone quality of an instrument, consisted of these harmonics that were in a mathematical relationship. They also consisted of a certain envelope. They lasted for a certain time. They had a decay. They had an attack portion. And to me, the idea that this note just was no longer this small little thing. And it was really a bit like what John was saying yesterday. I was very interested in that small attack that you get, like when you speak, that gave it the tone quality. So that big burst of noise when you play the flute or play the cello, that gives it this recognizable thing. And I just love, so this is why I have my very crude little picture down here on the right of the envelope that goes over a sound to give it its kind of sound shape. So in other words, a timbre or a violin had a shape. A flute had a kind of a shape, and they had a certain pattern. And to me, this was very appealing, this pattern that these sounds might have. I also was very taken with the idea that you could build sound like layers. So similarly, what you might do with animation, you can build your layers with your images. And the idea that sound evolves in time. So it's a temporal evolution. It's not a static thing. So these were all concepts in my head, temporality, layers. And so I was very interested in playing with these things. But as I said, my whole idea of the note completely changed. So I did this drawing at the time of the musical note was along this black dot, as it were. But inside it had the harmonics, you know, the pitch, if you wanted to get a pitch sound. But in fact, also sound went out into the space. It extended beyond the note, and it went out into the air. So this was kind of, I really liked that idea. And I said to myself, I've got a career now, I'm going to do sound design. That's it, I love sounds. And so a part of it was, we learned about Pierre Schaeffer. We were told to do, we had to create music concrete compositions where we had to cut up the sound and reassemble and reorganize. And I suppose this idea of the recorded sound being a kind of a sound object in itself, the sound fragments, you might say record a sound, cut it up, and that little small fragment is actually an object. And that's like a note or a musical note or an alphabet. And that to me was really liberating, the fact that you could record some little thing and that could be your starting point. So at that time, I wasn't able to do recordings, so we were told to use found objects. So any sounds we could pick up from the internet, even though the internet was pretty basic at that time, 96. And you could play around with these sounds, record and rearrange them and create something totally new. So therefore, sound and this idea of the object that no longer was sound, you know, had to be kind of abstractly thought about. The object, and even though object might seem like an abstract thing as well, but the sound, even as a waveform, even in the computer, was an object. Maybe for Pierre Schaeffer, it was actually a piece of magnetic tape, and he could hold this tape in his hand. But also, you're kind of holding the sound in your hand also in the computer because you're manually operating on it. And therefore, I was really interested in this, so I thought I'm going to do music concrete composition for the rest of my life because I really liked it. So I loved this hands-on approach that you could, therefore now I could kind of manipulate sounds. I could play with them. I didn't have to compose a symphony, not that I ever really did that, but I did a small string quartet once. And the idea that you could manually operate and not know what was happening beforehand. I just love this idea of not knowing, that you were discovering, and you're discovering through your hearing. And of course, Pierre Schaeffer, his whole philosophy was that sound was through listening. You know, you're composing through listening. So I found this idea of listening, the idea that now that it was a physical thing, you can access, operate, and then you can play it back repeatedly. And it's in that repeated playing back, you come to know the music in a very different way than if you were sitting in a performance and receiving a music performance. So therefore, I was looking for, and as Musique Concrète is all about trying to look for the sonic quality, or maybe something sonorous that you like, that you've drawn to as being kind of musical. And so it's all about the listening experience. So I quite enjoyed this. Now, at the time, I wasn't sure I was really creating music. I thought, you know, some of the music that I created then is hard on the hearing because I was playing around with noise and stretching it and creating pitches. But anyway, in some ways, this was where I was at. But then you might think, what has this got to do with images at this point? Because, you know, we were really in a sound course, we're doing everything about music technology. But these were the things I enjoyed doing: sound recording, processing, synthesizing sound, recreating sounds from the bottom up, from the sine waves. But my first time to work with images when we were given an assignment, and in the assignment we were asked, could you add some sound to a video? Just get any video at all, just put it in the Premiere. We want you to edit the sound and do proper sound editing, because they thought we might be working with film. And I said, yeah, that was our assignment, and I was very interested in it. But instead, I decided, well, I don't know how to do that. Where am I going to get the video? Where am I going to start? What sounds am I going to use? So I was really interested in this music here. I'm just going to play it here. It's a sound like that. It was a kind of a timbre. And we were given the option trying to edit cleverly. It was a piece of music by Kaya Sarayaho, Vergem Blangen. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. It's dazzling and blinding. And I decided I was going to start with the sound. I wasn't going to start with the images or the video. I decided the sound was going to be my narrative. And that's where I started working with the visuals. So it's quite accidentally I brought in a few images. And I suddenly realized that maybe this is what I'm actually doing is a form of concrete. I wanted to kind of create images that suggested the listening experience of listening to this sound. It was like a timbre, it was a vibration, and I thought, I really like that. How could I recreate that visually? And it was a real struggle because I'd never worked with images in the computer before. I'd never really worked with Photoshop, but because I was so determined to get this quality that I was after, I said, I have to get in here and work with it and see what I can come up with. And what I was after was what I call a shimmering vibratory surface. A type of visual timbre, like a musical instrument. And I said, so where am I going to find these images? Where can I find an image that's like that? So I was looking on the internet, because we were looking for found footage, where can I get an abstract image that sounds like a musical instrument? I couldn't find anything, but what I decided to do is I'll have to try and make it myself. So what I found was I created, so I started realizing that I was approaching the image as if it was a concept of sound. I was looking for sounds, I had sound processes, I was going to be operating on the images the same way I did with sound. I was going to filter them, I was going to process them. I didn't know that this was probably something that's already been done in abstract work in the computer, but I said, I need to find my objects. So I went out, I listened to the sound, it suggested trees, it suggested kind of objects floating in space. So I allowed myself to, what am I looking for? So I picked these footage, and there's just these simple items here. I particularly liked the pattern of the birds in flight, the trees, look at the upwardness of the trees. I made this little texture myself in Photoshop, my first time to use Photoshop, trees. And then I also said, I need to get something with rhythm in it. So I said, where am I going to get this fast vibratory rhythm? And I said, maybe someone playing the piano. So I'm not going to play the music in this, but this was kind of what I found. And because that had the quality of someone moving around fast, playing rhythmic music, I thought, there's my base. That's my starting point. And I also wanted to say maybe a nice floaty feeling, because it had a floaty sensation. So again, this was a Sade, who was kind of a pop star at the time. Of course, I would have to go to the very end. I'm just going to play that. And just that kind of floaty effect. So I started getting little fragments of things that I thought suggested this timbre, this shimmering sound. And I started building my images. So one of the things I noticed was, okay, this is really exciting. Now, initially it was not, what I was doing was a bit clumsy, but I had to create a whole library of these little fragments. And I said they're not okay as they are, because being kind of interested in art, they had to have nice colors. I couldn't leave them as they were. They'd be just too raw. So as I was listening to one of the pieces of music, I became aware that sometimes I had these little objects, what I call sound objects. So when I heard the music, there was a definite little gesture. I said, I want to try and capture that. Now, at this point, I didn't realize I was moving into the animation area, where you're creating these little moving objects, these little mini pieces of motion. So I was calling these like little sonic figures. So I was still always using musical language, because that was like where I was at. And so in this case, I was listening for the sonic events. Sometimes I was where I wanted to get this timbre, this background thing. Then I wanted these events. So I had to craft each of the little events. It was very much a handcrafted thing. So one of the sounds suggested this kind of movement, like a claw. And I thought, how can I create that kind of movement? And so therefore, that's what I was trying to do with this part of the piece. So I've decided I wanted to manipulate. So this was that little image is what I created in Photoshop, but then I realized I need to kind of layer them. Now, I didn't even know the term compositing at this point, so I just knew I could layer things in Premiere, and you could use blend modes and things like that. As Paul, you were talking about blend modes as well. So this idea that I could layer, so this is now this kind of little gesture. It was just a tiny little object, and it went with that dramatic moment. And so I was identifying these dramatic moments, feeling that I wanted to kind of recreate a kind of visual experience with the visuals. I was also aware that when you're listening to music, it gives a sense of direction, movement, forces. So it was like it was happening in my mind's eye, but also maybe in my body. I was very conscious that I could feel that like because of maybe understanding music, but maybe even just ourselves as human beings, sometimes music suggests it's going upwards, maybe going across, downwards. So I thought, how can I do that? So I realized that I have to kind of maybe try and create these layers and layers of different movements. And again, because I understood sound as being a layered thing, I thought, I want these movements, because it's about motion and timbre, I want them to I wanted to capture the different kinds of movements I was sensing just by listening to the sound. So very roughly, I thought, if I could get things to be just going up and down, that in itself was interesting. How to pace it was a challenge. As I said, it was very raw, this kind of animation. Maybe certain direction, diagonal, and maybe crisscross motion. I was very interested in that I felt that might get that quality that I was after. So this was kind of an example then when I eventually did start blending them together, because I wanted to blend the motions. And this was just like these are like 6 or 7 layers. And each of them are an independent motion layer, you could say, where it had motion in it. And this just is another piece later where maybe I got a little bit more sophisticated with it. I wanted one motion to be going forward and the other one to be going backward at the same time. So rather than going crossways. So in this way, this is my own recording video. The other ones were found footage. So again, I kind of had this kind of motion where this was going... I'm zooming in and I'm walking forward, and I'm getting that sense of the pull between the motions. So I was very conscious. That's what I was experiencing when I'm listening to music. I feel the motion. I can feel the movement of, say, the different instruments. So this was kind of where I was at. So I decided, these are the things I want to explore. Get that kind of nice shimmering surface. And this is what I came up with when I started blending and getting the shimmering surface that I was after. And this is just a small little snippet of it here, of Dazzling and Blinding. And again, I'm just showing it as a surface, because I'm going to show you the piece now in a second. And that was that. To me, that was timbre. That was very musical. It had a musical quality that was to do with sound design, and that was what I was after. So my very first visual music piece then was created for this assignment. I became very, very obsessed with this area. Even my teacher, who was teaching us about primary, says, "You don't have to take it so seriously more. It's okay." I said, "But I was creating all the images. It's only about the sound you're going to be assessed on." But I became very interested in the images. So I submitted it, and I called it a visual form of music, Concrète. It's Dazzling and Blinding. It was to be made for VHS tape at the time, so it only had to be 320 pixels by 240 pixels, so it was very small. And this was in '97. So I'm going to show you, it's only 45 seconds. As I said, all those things were happening, that concrete idea, and I'm keeping it kind of small because if I make it bigger, it'll be very pixelated because it's a very small work. So that was the very first little piece I created, and I was hooked at this point. I thought, okay, I'm really interested in this. So therefore, what I was really doing was, my concept was timbre, musical timbre, layering. Perhaps what I was doing was probably a kind of a cross-sensory, metaphorical crossover between concepts of working with understanding sound and working with it. I used the exact same processes with working with images. So I considered like images to be like objects. I considered them to be having direction and movement, and also maybe texture, trajectories through texture, direction through texture. And that's why I felt music's quite complex. So I wanted to create complexity. I was really interested in complexity. And I also was very aware that this is a compositional thing too. When you're composing, you're juxtaposing elements. So I became aware that maybe composition and all that kind of things that you might do with music, and also with images, they're the same kind of creative urge. They're the same language. This juxtaposition, direction, movement. So I felt, I think I'd like to work with this in this way. So this would be my very first process, would have been to create this visual form of Concrète. I would gather my recordings. I would pick out things that I really liked, like light or colour. Particularly light, I was very drawn to things with a reflection quality. And then I would manipulate and process them, listen to music, identify sonic images and objects, and then sculpt and build the final composition. So it was more like a sculpting. I wasn't really, one thing I really love when I'm looking at other people's work, I love people's work who's so opposite to mine, who can handle sparsity and minimalism, because I can't do that. It just has to, I'm like, the kitchen sink has to kind of go in there. I'm a kind of maximalist, but I do appreciate other styles. But it's because I am working with surfaces, and I'm really just like that idea of motion, and I love the idea of sculpting and building things through these surfaces. So again, start to realize a surface for me is an object. It's actually a discrete object. It can be very distinct in its own life, or it can be actually something that happens through merging. So you create new surfaces, just like you create new sounds. When you mix two sounds together, and depending on how you mix them, they can create a completely new sound, or if they're, how they're offset in time. So I was aware of layering, and I'm very conscious that a lot of people have talked about layering here as well. It seems to be a very common aspect of sometimes working with this. So to me, layering was a bit like identifying the fundamental harmonic in a tone. You layered it in order to create that sense of a timbre, or some kind of a world that was that existed in itself, and it wasn't jumping around the place. It wasn't really been editing. The whole world was there immediately in the very first minute you see the work. So that probably was to me like a musical thing. But my next work was I was more aware I was doing this, maybe a little bit more self-conscious. And I was aware I was creating these surfaces. So I was still exploring. I still wasn't really sure what to call this. So I was working again with real images as objects. So I wasn't seeing them as being, this is actually a video of my sister. I did recordings. I was very interested in this idea, where do we begin and where do we end? The digital technology opened something up in my mind that, are we really separate anymore? So I wrote kind of a small poem, and I suppose I was philosophically pondering on the whole idea of digital, and the fact you can manipulate things, and that you can make things not be what they were originally, even make images of people with trees in their heads, and all kinds of things. I was very excited for that surreal idea. So again, in this case, but my method was, I was trying to get the surfaces to blend. So I was sculpting, creating new spaces. And this is just a short excerpt from Edges, another work where I was playing around with multiple spaces, multiple motions, and playing around with people and things as objects. They weren't actually, like trying to create a story. Sorry, the way PowerPoint goes funny. So what I was doing was trying to handle I wanted to handle motion, though, more in abstract imagery, but I was finding it very difficult. The events were too discrete. They were too separate. What about temporal evolution? I had great difficulties with that, getting things to change gradually over time. Because, again, I didn't know about animation, that you could keyframe things. I started realizing when I animated a surface, it was too big, you got pixelation, so I was very frustrated with that. How do I work with these things? So I decided to continue to keep working, but I wanted to move more towards abstraction. I was very much making that choice. And now I started to really see now, okay, this is no longer now objects. Yeah, that's great, I enjoyed working with them. This is visual material. It's like sonic material. And this, of course, I do abstract painting, I always have, I like abstraction. So I found, I was thinking of the sound metaphor. When you mix sound, you can create a new sound. You can merge sounds. Sometimes you can hear the simultaneous tones. You could hear a flute playing the note C and a piano playing the note C. And you can hear them, we can notice that they're playing at the same time. But sometimes when you mix sound and you played around with them in time, you can't hear the distinction anymore. They become a new sound. They have qualities of the flute and qualities, say, of the violin. And I like that idea when they merge and become something new. I wasn't really interested in as they were as discrete. So I wanted to create big, huge sound masses. I was interested in that. And so therefore that was what I was interested in, maybe when something moves between pitch, being ordered, and noisy. So they were kind of what I was doing with sound. But I felt also with visual material, it had a visuality, like sound has a sonorous potential. Visual has a kind of visuality. You have, they can be merged, they can be discrete, they can be interacting, they can have motion, colours and form. And they were the things I was looking for. So I became aware then, maybe what if I create complexity through offsetting things in time, a bit like you would with an echo. So the idea that you would actually copy something right into itself. And again, a lot of people mentioned that in this talk about, say, taking a unit and then copying it into itself. So that's what I became. You do that with sound, you see. So I was trying to play in this kind of complexity. So this idea that in sound, with an echo, how to create an echo, you have your original sound fragment, you copy it and paste it a tiny bit offset in time, and then you paste it in on top at a certain reduced volume. Then you do that a few times, and you get a sense of reverberation, which is basically how sound acts in the space. It comes back. It takes a couple of milliseconds to come back to you, and you get that nice quality of the room. Whereas if you're in a room that didn't have any reflections, the sound would be very dry. It would be just the original sound source. So I thought, how could I do that with images? So I played around with that. So these were some of the little experiments I was doing. Whereas offsetting things in time, and even though sometimes it was with objects, this again was a picture of a head moving in time. And again, you can see it's layered. There's several versions of it. Offset. Again, I use the same echo idea. I was offsetting in time. I loved the effects it created, but I still felt I was kind of very raw with what I was and again, I offset this person moving through a room. I was creating surfaces with motion surfaces. And I was very aware that when you did this, you created an interesting emotional quality. There's something about this. Sometimes I also used to think my works were a little bit scary, whatever it was I was doing with them. They were ghost-like because I was interested in these kind of artifacts of echo. So copying paste was a simple thing, but I was more interested in compositing, getting it to become one surface, a bit like timbre. So as I said, this is an example here of this compositing the surfaces, where I was real images, also kind of abstract images. I didn't really mind so long as they suggested the sound. This is Barry Truax, a fantastic composer from Canada, who does a lot of sound synthesis work. And again, that music appealed to me. These are just examples, again, this compositing, creating a complete surface that looked like it could exist. It's kind of like a real thing. So these idea of surfaces interacting and becoming merged, and again, so they were quite strange, but the music was strange. So I was creating kind of like what I call a world. And again, I was making a comment about how I was experiencing digital technology. I felt I no longer had any boundaries, that you could do whatever you liked with this. And again, animation is very like that. You can create any kind of world with it. So I started realizing that I was more interested in sculpting these spaces. And they're not necessarily real spaces, they're imaginary spaces, and they're surfaces. Each one of these are a surface. So I'm just showing you a small clip. So sometimes I like to create a room. So it's nearly like for some reason I like to create this sense of perspective. I also maybe might try to create maybe an object. So this one's a mathematical object, it's towards one. And this is a work I did for my thesis, and I was exploring mathematical harmony. But I'm only showing you a short snippet here. It's a harmony object. This one then is another object. It's a room, and this is based. That was really based on mathematical harmony. It represented all the geometric ratios, so it was really involved thinking about the object. This one I was more interested. We were taking a novel called Silk, and myself and a music composer, Linda Buckley in Ireland, we came together and we wanted to create an experience, an aesthetic experience. But I felt that this was a suggestion of a passage from a novel, and it was an experience of someone who's kind of getting this experience of stop time. Their heart had stopped. They were so in love with this person. It was a beautiful love story, and we called it Silk Thread Stop Time. But I felt and this person was always in these rooms. It was based in Japan and France. It was based on the silk trade, bringing the silk back to France from Japan and China. And I was really interested in creating that rather maybe a sensory experience. These are all motion surfaces that have been all added together and to create a kind of an interaction of motion that's happening simultaneously, which I feel in music things happen simultaneously. So it has a kind of complexity. So it takes a while for these motion surfaces to arrive. So that's what I was doing with this one. And again, this is another example of I was trying to recreate a room. And this time I like all kinds of music. So this is a case of recreating a disco. But again, it's a motion object. And the music is by my daughter, who's actually sitting in the audience here. Their band Silk, and I'm just going to play a little section of that. And it's recreating these architectural, sculptural objects.
You know, I had a thought. I was in the dark. No light shining through. My mind was escaping me.
So again, these are little objects, they're little motion surfaces, they're repeated, like that's the same motion surface repeated 3 or 4 times on the floors, on the side. So it creates a kind of continuity. But again, and I'm also working with the music, so I am inhabiting the music, or I'm trying to get the music to inhabit these spaces. So they're very architectural. So moving on, I've only a few more screens to show you, and then I'm going to show you some works. I became very interested in the idea then. I still was on this journey. That's why this has been an amazing opportunity to realize that sound is still very much, I'm trying to recreate that temporal evolution that was so challenging at the beginning. Every work, I'm always trying to get that sense of continuity. So I wasn't able to do it in the first few years. And I realized in my later work, I was always trying to get that. So I really am delighted to realize that's what I've been doing. Anyway, the idea that every grain and pixel counts. So in some ways, another part of sound synthesis is granular synthesis. I don't know if people are aware of that type of synthesis. It's where the sound a very tiny piece of, you might have a sample of sound, and you then take more tiny samples out of that between 0 and 100 milliseconds, and they're considered like little pieces of time and little pieces of frequency, which is what we might hear as pitch. And they can be anywhere in the spectrum of sound. So if you're breaking them down to these tiny little grains, you can then get these kind of, what they discovered with this process is that you can start building sounds with these by maybe making them into dense amount of grains, move them across the whole sonic surface, as it were, playing around with speed and force. So this granular synthesis technique allowed you to have access to these parameters, these things like density, sparsity, speed, force, direction, constants, distance. And that reminds me, and now of course I didn't know about this at the time, particle systems that you might use in animation, where you have access to the particle and that can scatter everywhere, and it's the exact same metaphor. So I thought, maybe how can I do this with visuals? And I found it an awful challenge. It took me a long time before I was able to do it. This is like the idea of Xenakis Barry-Truax talked about sound cloud, where they can these grains of sound can be anywhere in the frequency and time domain, and they have shapes nearly, as it were. But you don't really hear those shapes. They really sound like explosions. So the idea then, maybe how could I get that sense of these grains and emotion surface? And I really want to create that vibratory surface. So I was always thinking about this, never was able to really do it. And I finally got to do it in a piece. Again, I'm very fortunate to be able to work with my daughter who does music. We worked on this one, which is, she did granular synthesis on some of her sounds, and I created what I wanted this granular with. I don't know if you know of a software called Isadora. It's kind of a bit like Mac's MSP, where you can generate visuals from sound, amplitude, and frequency. And a lot of people talked about that here. Now, again, I use this just to create my sound sources, or my visual sources. It wasn't going to be my composition. I was creating objects. So I experimented with creating granular images with granular sounds like Barry-Truax and other people's music I was listening to. But I realized I was after that quality of just the explosion, as it were. So it was generative. It was basically, I was interested in forces. I was interested in maybe the look and feel, naturally enough. I was listening and attending to what was happening with all these forces. And therefore, particle systems was something I eventually moved towards. But at this stage, it was a kind of a particle system in this Isadora software. I know you can do it in After Effects quite easily now, and lots of maybe coding, you can get access to particle systems as well. But anyway, I realized that it wasn't good enough just to leave it as it is. It's a bit like having a big burst of noise. It had to have tension and resolution. And that's when I started to realize I'm composing now. I'm no longer now just playing with sounds, image sources, image objects, image surfaces. I want to compose a work that brings you on a journey. It was no longer, and therefore I considered that to be a bit like composition. And I felt, how can I resolve the tension? That would be something that I was kind of asking myself. But this is the granular surface I eventually was so happy that I did find. So I was resolving the tension. I wanted it to kind of build up, and then that change of scene just kind of gives a little bit of relief. And I was very aware that I had to bring in those relief points, a bit like you might do with music. So to maybe kind of move towards maybe leading you into the works I'm going to show, I was very interested in the fact that you can create complex motion through interacting motion surfaces. The very nature of pixels being added together and blended creates new things. I like the fact I didn't know beforehand what I was creating, that I just experimented with layers. So I would have extensive layering. And again, I made a kind of another discovery, and I'm sure loads of people have discovered this as well, but you kind of come across these things through the doing of it, that actually form actually emerges in the motion. In this interacting surface, maybe things copied into itself, these forms emerge just for a second. You go, oh, I really like that. I need to stay with that. That's something that's really interesting. But I wouldn't have an idea that this is going to happen. I was just looking out for them. So that's a typical music concrete idea. You're listening out for what's sonic. I was looking out for the form. And I knew that the motion was going to create it. So all those, this is a work visual derived. Some of my layers might have 50, 60 layers. I mean, it's a bit like Paul all, you're it's a real meditative process. You really work with this. You say it's not right, yeah, it's not right. Keep trying the next one, layer and layer and layer. And I found that this became my method of working. I found that the first image of work, the starting image, came after I did this extensive experimentation with motion surfaces, and eventually through interacting and playing with them, I found the image, the starting image. Here we go, I can now create my work. So it was I allowed myself the pain and the discomfort of the 2 weeks of going, this is horrible, it's not nice, I'm not getting there. And now I allow myself that time, I give myself the 2 weeks, and I consider that now the ground, but it would have taken 2 weeks of motion experiments, and now I've got my image I'm after, and I'm very, very drawn to colour, of course. Certain music suggests colours, just associative sounds, and I can't do the piece unless it's in those colours. So this music suggested red and black, and this is just an example of the idea then, the scattering of the surfaces. That I then play that surface. I play around with that form and its motion through time. Of course, the last point I want to make then, of course, I realise that it's not just about, like, say, composition, it's about sensory experience. That when you bring abstract images together with music, you can do something with people's senses. And I was really interested in that. So one work I was created, we were actually asked to literally, this was our task, take the novel, which is it was kind of a sensational type of knowledge, with very evocative scenes in it. There was very beautiful scenes. So I was working with a collaboration in this one, but we were really trying to recreate the sensory experience just through abstract images and sound. We didn't want to have any narrative, but someone that knows the novel said to me she got the novel from it. So it was interesting. We took 3 scenes and we basically played around with our artistry. And there was a scientist involved, Dermot, and in one of his presentations, he was very aware of the motions. He added in a little bit of form and synthesis, which is the way our vocal track works, having this idea that we are drawn to anything that sounds human. We have an emotional reaction. So he was very conscious that synthesis, using chroma and colour, is something very innate to us all, that we will respond to it. So it's just this idea of an aesthetic experience. And this one is just like, it was a scene called, a very sensuous paragraph, describing the sensations the protagonist got when he was getting a massage by this mysterious girl that he was brought to on his journey when he was doing the silk collection. And he was obviously quite in love with the idea of this person. He'd never met them. So it described the experience very tersely. It's a very paragraph that's very short. And therefore, this is kind of how I interpreted it. Very, very subtle motion. I was trying to get that feeling, massage, you're relaxing. So it was about trying to recreate that experience with abstract imagery. So in other words, I'm open to lots of different ideas. I'm moving on now quickly through this. And then I'm also open to my own sensations. So another work, I was working with microtonal music with Kobe van Tonder, another very South African composer. And her music was those tiny little tones. Of course, I'm drawn to that because I'm into tiny motions. So her music suggested everything this kind of stretching, a tension. So maybe it's tension and resolving the tension that I like to do. And there's this feeling of 2 anchor points that have been stretched. And that was just my structure for the piece. And again, so therefore, this was the final image that arrived for me. And then I brought that image on its journey. And that suggested that stretching outward and maybe also something moving upwards. So they were my gestures. So then to just conclude on the talk part, my working process with a visual music composition is I'm very aware that I'm composing motion. There's an identity that I try to get after for the first motion surface that takes a few weeks. Motion creates form for me, and I'm looking out for the emergence of form. Layering creates complexity, and I'm composing the visual elements with the visual music. Then I do the task of knitting it and weaving it with the music. So it's quite a hands-on craft that I do. I'm listening for motion figures, points of arrival and departure, resolving the tension, composing worlds, creating new worlds, and that's my visual music methods. And that's the end of my the talk part. So thank you very much for listening. Thanks.